Okay, welcome to your first video lecture over classification of matter. You should also be practicing taking your Cornell notes while watching this video. So let's just dive in. So the first thing that we are going to discuss is what is matter. There are two things that a substance must have to be considered matter, and that is mass and volume. So it has to have mass and it has to take up space. One special note I want to make about mass is that this is not the same thing as weight. Weight is gravity pulling on your mass. This is an important distinction that you'll make in physics. So when I refer to mass, I want you guys to remember that this is a little bit different than what you guys have discussed before, which is usually referring to weight. So let's talk about some examples of non-matter before we go further into what is matter. So some examples of non-matter are things like time, energy, heat is a good example, as well as light. So just to give you an idea of things that you should keep separate in your head when you're thinking of matter. So how is matter actually classified? There are two categories, pure substances or mixtures. When we are talking about pure substances, we are referring to either an element, so something that you can find on the periodic table, or a compound, which is two or more elements combined. So when you're referring to an element, you're referring to one type of atom that makes up that specific element. When you're referring to a compound, those are made up of what are called molecules, or something that you'll learn this year is known as a formula unit. We'll discuss the difference between these two things in the future. So basically anything that you can find on the periodic table, whether it be a single element or a couple of elements chemically combined. Now over here on the mixture side, you've got two types. You've got homogeneous mixtures, which are mixtures that are the same throughout. So sometimes these are actually referred to as solutions. So solutions in homogeneous mixtures are kind of one and the same. The next type of mixture is a heterogeneous mixture, which is exactly like it sounds. It's different throughout. So these are still considered mixtures, but they have different consistencies throughout. Some important distinctions to make between pure substances and mixtures before we start talking about some examples. Pure substances are chemically combined, and so you're going to have some sort of chemical reaction in order to separate a pure substance. For example, if you wanted to separate the hydrogens and the oxygens in H2O, you would have to do a chemical reaction known as decomposition. You would have to do something that would break those chemical bonds in between the elements. Now for mixtures, these are physically combined. That means that you can separate mixtures by physical means. We will go further into how you can separate mixtures in a different video. Okay, so before we wrap up this video, let's go ahead and discuss a couple of examples. So for pure substances, we either have elements or compounds. So a good example of an element would be like a diamond. Diamonds are actually made of pure carbon. Another example would be oxygen, which is comes in the form of O2. Lead, sodium, any sort of element that you can find on the periodic table. Now compounds, remember that's two or more elements that are chemically combined. So that's going to be H2O. Usually you can tell that something is a compound by looking at it at its name, is because you can identify two elements in that name. So for example, sodium chloride, which is table salt. Another way that you know that something is a compound is that it's got a chemical formula. So for example, this is glucose. So you can see that there are three different elements, C6H12O6. Okay, so some examples of mixtures. Remember, we've got homogeneous or heterogeneous. Homogeneous mixtures are the ones that are the same throughout, so you don't have to mix them up. Once something is dissolved in something else, the bottom and the top of the solution are the same. So, for example, salt water, tea. Some other things that you may not think about are metal alloys like steel and brass. They are the same all the way throughout, so they are also considered homogeneous. Heterogeneous mixtures are things that you tend to have to mix up in order to, well, I guess mix them up. So, for example, salad dressing. Sand water is a really good example. Sand water you can shake up, but then eventually something's going to settle at the bottom. So the bottom's going to be different, the top's going to be different. Air is an example of a heterogeneous mixture that a lot of people tend to not think about. Air, we've got different layers of the atmosphere. Down here by Earth, it's going to be a little bit different than way up here at the top of the atmosphere. Milk is another good example of a heterogeneous mixture as well. Okay, so the important things that we discussed in this video and things you need to make sure you have written down are what is matter. So what are the two things that something needs to be considered matter? How is matter classified? So knowing the different categories that you can place a substance in. And then pure versus mixtures, knowing the difference between the two and being able to give me examples of each.